I would like to introduce Professor Paul Dembinski, Professor of Strategy and International Competition at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland, Director of the Geneva-based Foundation Observatoire de la Finance, and co-president of Ethics and Trust in Finance Prize, among a lot of other very rich activities. The topic of his plenary today is families, the unacknowledged center of any economy. Professor Dembinski, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's really a pleasure of being here. I'm afraid I left the voice somewhere in the airplane, so I hope it will catch up. But to some extent, it's not fully there. So I beg your pardon for this. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me. It was a pleasure to visit yesterday the Bucharest University of Economics and to have this opportunity to have some talks with professors and colleagues on many issues, including the question of ethics in finance, but also touching upon the question of economics of family. But I take, before starting my talk, I would just, because there are plenty of young people around, and Professor Kurka was speaking about education, I would just share a small anecdote that happened to me 2 or 3 weeks ago when I was visiting the Jesuit Center for Worldwide Learning. This network is providing distance learning to people like you, but unfortunately sitting in different camps, migration camps and things like this. And there was a set of small interviews, what people expect from this education, business education, international business, accounting, and so on. And one young lady, I don't remember where she was saying, well, we are here, we want to be trained, not trained for a profession, not trained to respond to labor market demand directly, but to make the world better. And coming from this environment, coming from this situation, I thought it is a message that I have to bring to younger audiences what I try to do here. The world has to be better, and we students, you students, but we are eternal students. So we students need to not to forget about it. We have to be formed and prepared for profession, but also be ready to change the world. So as the introduction has been made, I used to be an economist, and sorry, I forgot a very warm thanks to my friend Cornel Brabut, who is who left? He's here, Vice President of the European Federation of Christian Family Association, and that's the connection between the topic I'm going to address and the gathering here. As I told you, I'm an economist by training, dealing a lot with finance, ethics in finance, and it happened that I got interested at some moment why families are not addressed by economists and what can be done in order to bring the family as economic unit into the economic debate. So what I'm going to share with you are 2 chapters and the conclusion. One, it is about work, and the other one is about family, and all of it is about market, social market economy. So first bit is about humanity at work. You know probably that 2019 is the year of the 100th anniversary of the International Labour Organization. You can imagine why this organization was set in Versailles. The Russian Revolution was 2 years old, and of course there was more than possibility of the revolution spreading not only to Western Europe, but possibly also to the United States. So something has to be done about labor. That was the beginning of International Labour Organization. Today, I discovered, because I was a little bit involved in some works around the ILO, I'm living in Geneva, so it's Geneva-based organization, so things happen. And I asked myself, what do we know about where the humanity, not European population, not African population, not Romanian population, but humanity is working? Can we provide a broad picture? And some of the elements of this picture I will introduce now. So, okay. So I have to start because I said a statistical picture. I was working and some of my books are about statistics on globalization. And I think this is an interesting quote because counting is a heavy duty and there is a dilemma behind. And I think it applies to family, to work, to all, to many, many aspects of economic life which are not crystal clear, precise. And what says a journalist who wrote an excellent book on statistics, David Boyle, but Einstein and Keynes have said things which are very similar. What he says is, if we don't count something, it gets ignored, especially in the age of digitalization and quantification. And if we count it, it gets perverted. It gets perverted because by de facto we have to homogenize realities that are by definition heterogeneous. So building categories, opening boxes and putting stuff into the boxes it's a potential perversion. So keeping this in mind, and it's not the joke, keeping this in mind, let's try to go forward. So what ought to be counted if you want to look at humanity at work? So let's turn to an international instrument, one of the conventions of labor statisticians in 2013, where they were trying to define what is work. What writes this resolution? Work comprises any activity performed by persons of any sex and age to produce goods or to provide services, and this comes very important, for the use of others and for own use. Work is defined irrespective of its formal or informal character or the legality of the activity. So we have goods and services, we have use of others and own use, very important. Work which takes place in formal environment, labor contracts and so on, established enterprises, and work that is taking place in informal environment. I will come back to it in 2 minutes. But do we exhaust with this the definition of work? If we turn to Christian thinking and we pick up a document which is important in Catholic Church, which is the Compendium of the Social Doctrine, and I think that Orthodoxy shares to a large extent with Catholicism this perspective on work, which says work represents a fundamental dimension of human existence. We are not in producing goods, we are in existence, as participation not only to the creation, but also the act of redemption. So we have these two definitions, one saying very economic and down to earth, and the other one which opens another dimension to work. Just to keep in mind that if we count something, we fundamentally have to pervert something because we cannot satisfy all the criteria. So what is counted in existing labor statistics? And you may know that ILO, International Labour Organization, is publishing the labor statistics, but is using the statistics that are produced by national labor offices, and this Conference of International Statisticians is trying to provide principles and guidelines to these local or national statistical offices in order to provide at the world level something of more or less coherent. So what is really counted? And it's not exactly what is in the first definition, and you will see why. There are two reasons for this. But first, there is a very deep influence of the labor market perspective. Labor market, students I think here and we all know that it's about supply and demand, and it's about remuneration. So labor market perspective leaves de facto aside some of the activities which are the activities for own use, which are the activities more difficult to identify, especially within the domestic economy. I will come to it in a minute. So work, from the economist perspective, work is recognized when there is remuneration. It can be a wage, or can be, in the entrepreneur world, it is a profit, but it's a remuneration. Work, by economists, most of the economists see and teach work as the opposite of leisure. So either you are in a leisure situation or you work. There is nothing in the middle. So your 24 hours are sleep, okay, live it, it's biological and physiological needs, and leisure or work, and work with remuneration. So you think that there's probably something missing in this equation. And when we go for work seen as remuneration, related to remuneration as non-leisure, well, in labor perspective, labor economic perspective, labor is very close to a commodity. When, in the other definition, we have seen that it has to do about dignity, about existence, about creation, about possibly redemption. So, commodification of work is a trend that is inspired and is to some extent present also in statistics. So reality of human activity, as we all know from daily experience, is probably less negative. It's not only something which is boring and non-leisure. It is not only this quest of remuneration. We have a lot of activities and a lot of work we do is done in the relationship settings, in domestic economy, and has gift as a right maybe name. So, you probably know that the term work, travail en français, is coming from this torture that was used by the Romans. And when we speak about work, there is, especially in some languages more than the others, there is this idea of suffering, of the suffering. So possibly, and I hope so, we can broaden the picture and not only keep the suffering side of work, but also some more positive dimension into work. Now, if we look at the statistics, these are ILO published statistics. You have a number of countries, and especially group of countries, according to the level of income. So you have Japan and Uganda as extremes situation, and you have in the middle of the graph different groups of countries. This is the age structure. And there is a dividing line. The dividing line is visible on the graph. On one side you have what is called the labor force. On the other side you have those that are out of the labor force. And the criteria is age. So the bulk of what is labor force is people between 25 and 64, and depending on regions, some bits and pieces of the population that is either older than 64 or younger than 24. So, but you see the more or less 55, 56, 57% of the population, and it's valid for most of the categories, 55, 56% are labor force, the rest is outside of the labor force, sticking to the statistics, and I will try to correct them, if I may, in a few minutes. So now let's turn to work context. Now we had the demographic picture of labor population. It counted in units, in heads. That's very important. It's counted not in time, but in units, in heads. So coming back to the statistical documents, which set the objective. No, they're not describing what is in statistics, unfortunately, but they set the objective towards what the statistics should direct their efforts. So the same resolution lists various contexts, what they call economic units, in which work may take place. And you have 3 of them. And we are getting closer to the question of family. Market units, well, the standard corporation, quasi-corporation, household, family enterprises, and so on. We have the non-market units, well, we all know that's government, NGOs, and associations, and things like this. And we have households that produce goods and services for its own use. So, if we push this definition to some limits, if I walk my dog, it's a work performed within household economy. Important. Nothing about this in the statistics, you will see. So, technical problem. The implementation of these definitions that I mentioned of the resolution 2013 collides with another well-established principle that uses the person, the head count, as the statistical unit of analysis. What does it mean? It means that if I'm a professor, my head is counted in the non-market units. And that's it. If I walk my dog, it disappears from the statistics because I'm counted within those that are work in non-market units. So this principle means that a given person's activity is statistically attributed only to one type of economic unit. Exactly what I said. So therefore, my walking the dog does not appear in the household, disappears from the perspective. So if we look at this key of looking at employment and labor activity in different countries, you see a different picture. You have four blocks of countries with different colors. You have the blue for family workers, which are acknowledged to some extent. You have employees, you have employers. So you have 4 categories, and here you start to see the differences which are due to regional institutional economic settings. We have a very high level of formal employment in northern countries, and we have a very low share of it in low-income countries and between the intermediary situation. And of course, I forgot to mention the own account workers. You see what is in green on the screen, not exactly in green on mine. In green, which are the self-employed. People that have an activity, they are not entrepreneurs, they are not employees, they are somewhere in between. And the share of this population is growing, statistically speaking, with the level of income. So that's another entry point into labor statistics. But there is a problem, to a large extent related to the self-employed workers, but not only, the problem of informality. A recent study conducted by ILO, with a slightly different methodology than the one I mentioned, is concluding that informality, so broadly understood lack of contractual setting, either lack of employment contract or lack of insurance, lack of pension, lack of health insurance, etc., it's about 60%, it's an estimate, 60% of work that is carried out within these definitions, is carried out in the world. 60%. Of course, it's much lower in Europe, it's much higher in Africa. But nevertheless, at the world level, it's 60%. So, I just opened a small bracket. The ILO, you can see the report that has been produced for the centenary of ILO, you can download it. for the future, for a better work. They acknowledge that we have been thinking for decades that informality will disappear, and now we see not only it does not disappearing in developing countries, but is reappearing through Uberization of different kind of activities, is appearing where it was almost disappeared, especially in industrial, so-called industrial north. So it's an important problem if you want to know where humanity is working, to identify or to be aware of the fact that informality is just a small problem. It's not informality. It's not something that is, we can define as well, residual category. No, it's the majority, it's the middle. We have to confront it as such. So, coming back to what is our topic. So, we can divide the view on where humanity is working, I think, in two categories and two subcategories. One is the labor market activities with the formal side and the informal side. And in the formal side, you have a lot of things. In informality, as I said, it's more difficult to distinguish. And, which is not in the statistics, is the activity within the domestic economy. Because when I'm walking my dog, as professor, it does not exist. So what is the picture? That's about informality. I can drop it at different countries. We can come back to it in the discussion. I will not use your time. So the problem number 3 is exactly with this domestic sphere, because domestic sphere is not properly recorded, as most people share the time, as me walking my dog, between, I don't have the dog anymore, that's pity, but between more than one type of unit of activity. So the domestic sphere is often overridden by the labor market type of approach. I'm affected to labor market unit of activity, non-government, non-market one. So, I propose, and in the slide that follows, I used a different approach. I started from the fact asking myself, well, take 24 hours of a normal day of humanity. One day, not looking at the annual statistics and so on, but just one day, 24 hours, taking away half of it for psychological needs, and we are left with about 12 hours. So where does it go? It's a very, very order of magnitude estimate. So we end up with this picture. The picture is as follows. You have the employment, the domestic economy at the bottom, the formal economy at the top, and in the middle, the informal one. No, because there is a mixture of colors and kind of. So domestic economy is in the bottom, the formal economy is the middle, and the informal part of the economy is on the top in green. So you see on a global level, if we look at 24 hours, it's an estimate, but nevertheless we need an estimate. So almost half of energy and time is taking place within the domestic economy. About 20% are taking place in the formal world, and 30% more or less are taking part in the informal world. Of course, it's an average, and different countries has different proportions. But what is common is the base between 40 and 50% of socially available time is spent within households. Broadly understood, I'm not trying to define what is a household, what is not. What is sure, and even statistical inquiries show it very clearly, leisure is only a small component of it. As economists would say, either work or leisure. No, it's much more complicated. So what happens, and that's the second part of it, what happens within this household sector? And I think here we have to discuss why economists are reluctant to pick up the question of economics of family. So as you know, probably the etymology of economy is drawing on the oikos, the household, broadly understood in ancient Greece. It was not me and my dog, it was much more complex, and it provided a lot of, producing a lot of stuff for subsistence. So exchange was only a residual activity. But I think which is also very important is to understand that the economist approach, or try to understand the economic activities by putting in the middle of the scene the famous Homo economicus. Homo economicus with this lonely individual which takes the decisions, maybe rational decisions, but takes the decision only in the perspective of its own needs. Satisfaction, utility, there are many approaches to it, we are not going to discuss it. But he is egoist, does not mean that he ignores the rest of the world. He is coldly rational, and the economic models consider it to a large extent as being the expression of the ultimate human nature. So it's not just a tool, but in many, especially in economics and management, the human being is portrayed often, hopefully not always, as being a quasi-homo economicus. But, as we all know, maybe not very young people, but the older ones that are in the room, that we seldom take decisions that are only individual. When we sign a work contract, of course I sign it, but after having discussed with my family, possibly with my friends or with my brothers or sisters, if I'm younger, so it's not an individual decision. It's a decision that in most cases, takes into account a broader perspective, let's call it a common good of a group. It's the same for housing, it's the same for lodging, it's the same for schools, etc., etc., etc. So it's not, the decision is formally individual, but is prepared, is set on different considerations. So it is important to be aware of that, because if we design policy measures on models that are based on the individualistic perspective, we forgot this common good, let's say, approach or element or dimension in any of economic decisions. So, okay, there is a complementarity between family and the economy. Because if we look at what's happening within households, it's a lot of economic activity. If we remember what is work, what's the creation of goods and services for own use or for market use, etc., independent on the context, informality or formality. So first of all, education. It's a fundamental. If there was no education, well, we could not have a good economy. We could not have good universities, because people would come to the university totally untrained and unprepared. Providers of care for young, for ill, for elderly, it's happening to an incredibly large scale, in some countries more, in some countries less. The families are regenerators of energies that make you start tomorrow to go to work, or especially on Monday. And it's acknowledged by most of sociological research. Producers, and at the end, producers of goods and services, which is more trivial, but a lot, I'm just making a small footnote. If we look at growth patterns of our economies, I'm speaking about Western economies, post-communist economies, it was a little bit different during these years, but nevertheless, it applies too. If we used to have a meal at home, and from one day to the other we go to the restaurant, of course, there is, in terms of GDP statistics, something has happened here. There was a creation of wealth, would say. But was it really a creation of wealth? It moved from one activity, which is an unobserved part of the economy, to an observed part, and we say, wow, it's new. It's not so new. People were not hungry. We're just eating in another setting. Which is better, which is worse, I'm not going to qualify. But we cannot say that nothing happened there. Of course, it's not the same for TV sets. When I buy a new TV set, I was not able to produce it at home. That's for sure. So, but all these efforts, what the family contributes to the economy, is somewhere hidden, is unobserved, is considered as being there forever, and the kind of windfall situation which is absolutely fundamental for the economic activity, but is there to last for a long time. And we should not, until recently, care too much about it. And here we can do a parallel with ecology. Until rather recently, maybe not just 2019, but 15, 20 years ago, the world started to consider environment as being something that has to be cared for. Until then, well, it was just there. And we could use it and misuse it, but it was there. So there was no reason to take care. Now we see the limits of it, climate change and so on, we start to say, well, we should preserve, we should maintain, because it's vital. And I think there is a parallel to be drawn, what's happening in the domestic economy, as I called it, which is not seen, but is fundamental. But the two are complementary, the market activity and, let's say, domestic activity are complementary, but there's also tension. And some people are more attracted to be on one side than on the other, for different reasons, monetization of life, etc., etc. So if the answer to the hypothesis, if the production of the household sector, of the domestic economy, shrinks significantly in terms of human education, in terms of care, in terms of pensions, in terms of regenerations, of course, service sector, the market could respond to it. But who could pay for it? It's something that will be unsustainable. Already today, we have in terms of GDP about between 25 and 30% of GDP that is used or that is used for health, social insurance, etc., etc. 30%. Could we go to 60, to 70, to 80? I'm not sure. There will be no TV sets anymore. So this unsustainable movement, this unsustainable burden, cannot be said just market will play it or state will play it. We have to look at the underlying economic activity. It's not social subsistence. It's economic activity. So, and the last point is this quote from François Pérou, who was a Christian economist, very important macroeconomist in France in the 40s, before even in the 30s. And he wrote a small booklet just after the war about capitalism. And he said, he has these 3 sentences that I suggest that we read and try to apply it both to social fabric, domestic economy fabric, think about in terms of ecology, and probably also in terms of moral fabric. A way of thinking that is prior and island to capitalism sustains for a variable period of time that framework in which capitalist economy operates. The framework in which capitalist economy operates. So capitalist economy has taken, if you want, roots in a setting, institutional, mental, etc. setting. But owing to the capitalist later very expansion and success, inasmuch as he received the esteem and gratitude of masses and fosters among them a taste of material comfort and well-being, he was writing it in early mid-40s. Well-being, it undermines the traditional institutions and the mental structures on which the very social order depends. Because it was carried from the past, it is used, and now it's challenged by the comfort and well-being. Capitalism erodes and corrupts, not in the sense of normal way of corruption, but corrupts in the sense of destroys. It consumes vast quantities of vital energy whose rise it does not control. Rise it does not control, it's coming from somewhere else. And then Turning to political readers need a rare cool-headedness in their diagnosis and an exceptional energy in administering the treatment if they are to detect and ward off this alignment before it is too late. So he was writing more than 50 years ago. I think this diagnosis is coming stronger and stronger and more urgent every day. To finish, I would like to share with you this graph, which has to do with Europe. As you know, the competitive social market economy is a model that is in the treaties, that is specially developed in the Lisbon Treaty, where the competitive qualification has been added. Social market economy is, let's say, an old story dating from immediately post-war Germany. So there is a social dimension, there is a market dimension, and there is a tension between the two. That was always the case in the soziale Marktwirtschaft. How much market, what kind of market, what regulation for the market, and what social. But under this social, we have to be very clear there are two elements. One is the redistribution, the public budget, expenses, subsidies, taxes, and so on. But on the other side, if you read the fathers of soziale Marktwirtschaft, they're very aware of the social fabric, what I called here the domestic economy. It was there. So the tension, how much market, how much social, it's not only how much public spending or how much taxes as opposed to how much free market. No, there is this third hidden element, which is not explicit, is seldom made explicit, and I try to make it explicit here. So yes, here we have the efficiency fight, we have the solidarity, welfare, etc. Dimensions, the state dimension. What Lisbon brought is the third one, which was not exactly in the loop in the soziale Marktwirtschaft that was seen as a closed economy. The question was not there. It was mentioned that globalization has not been around in the 40s. So, well, it was by nature something that was in a more closed economy than it is today. And here we have tension too. We have competitive, how to do it, how to achieve it, innovation, individualism, financial returns, incentives, monetization, etc., etc. But there is a tension. How much? How much with the world outside? How much internally? Well, and some instruments are coming back. And there is another set of tension, which is between the social and the competitive, which is communitarism, which is economic patriotism, which is global champions, national champions in globalization, and the quest for productivity and so on. So here for competitive, more and more, a world that would not dare to use 15 years ago, but today it's almost in the vocabulary, industrial policy, structure policy, even some cases exchange rate policy. We are in the Central Bank of Romania. They're not applying it, but nevertheless there are some international discussion who is playing exchange rates for which reason. Here we have this domestic economy and redistributive policies. So redistributive policies I mentioned, domestic economy, how to protect, how to make it blossom, how to make it really complementary to the market. And here we have all the competition stories, labor market flexibilization, etc., etc., etc. But it's not the same as domestic economy concerns and so on. So we are in tensions. And the recognition of the importance of the domestic economy is part of, even if it's implicit in the social, it's part of this equilibrating game that is going on within larger structures as Europe, smaller ones than nations, also to some extent at the global level. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Dembinski. Questions for Professor Dembinski, please.
Thank you. I would like to share a point. In the developing capitalist economies in South Asia, Southeast Asia particularly, we have something called the domestic helps. So I don't know whether you address this issue or not, but probably they are also involved with the family economy. So perhaps you might consider it as at some point if you haven't done it already. So that's the point I had to make. Thank you.
Nowadays in literature is in fashion to speak about impossibility trilemmas. In corporate organization, impossibility trilemma between sovereignty and globalization and democracy. Can we find this kind of impossibility trilemma in your scheme?